What can we say about the large-scale dynamics of brains? We have explored the idea of how to make a mathematical model of single neuron dynamics, right? That's a very simplified picture as described by McCulloch-Pitts theory. But when we go into the large scale, we have the whole story there. And it's difficult to see how we can actually say something relevant about the brain by using simple mathematical models, which is our goal in this course. Actually, we can look at that in the following way. If you think in the brain as a dynamical system, and the way we can explore these dynamics using, for example, electroencephalography or other techniques, there are many of them now, we gather a picture that is highly dynamical and that tells something about the system. For example, when we take electroencephalogram, which means taking information from different parts of the brain's skull or from the skull, what we see is that there's clearly some patterning. There's not a random signal, as complex as the brain is. It's not a random object. We see activity propagating through the system, right? The picture can be obtained either by looking at time series gathered from each of these points, or you can actually see the spatial dynamics in space. And you will see that there are waves moving around. These waves are not either totally ordered, like in a kind of a clock, nor random. They seem to have a mixture of both properties. We do see highly organized behavior when we have disease. For example, in an epileptic seizure, you see that the brain highly organizes itself. So in that case, instead of signals that go up and down in a more or less irregular fashion, what you will see is a very highly periodic wave, something that we don't want because you synchronize all over the place, and this very high activity regime means that you are likely to have, for example, seizures that imply lose consciousness, etc. In other states, like in a coma, what you have is an activity that is sustained, right, but is not organized. You have essentially a low amplitude signal that tells us that the brain is not working. It's not working at all. This actually can be organized in a whole picture, right, where you can actually think in the amplitude of the signals and try to organize the repertoire of things that we see, right, in a scheme where you will have here high amplitude that is characteristic, for example, of epileptic seizures. In this case, we will see in different locations, you will see that you have a very strongly periodic signal, right? It's almost periodic attractor. If you go down here, right, of course, this will be dead. The brain has no activity at all. You'll have a diverse range of states around here, lock-in patients, coma. You will see dream, sleep somewhere there, right? Not as very high amplitude, but you have some organization. You know that over the dream, sleep, we have brain activity, right? Somewhere here, right, between this disordered and ordered dynamics, again, in this state, for example, you do have a signal, right? But it's very low amplitude and highly disorganized. It's telling us that there's no coherence in the system. So somewhere in the middle is us, let's say the healthy state, right? The healthy brain, okay? So it is kind of a whole hierarchy of dynamical states here. And for some reason, brains are apparently between kind of two different regimes. Let's take it as this right now, right? This looks like a qualitative diagram. This is a diagram suggested by neurobiologist Walter Freeman and Christine Scarda in a very interesting paper where they suggested that, as you will see, some particular kind of dynamics might be implicit, relevant, and maybe absolutely necessary for healthy brain function. All right. So again, can I say something relevant about brain dynamics using a simple model? You will see that, yes, that's the case. To do it, let's consider the following. Let's look at the brain in this way, right? I take information from areas, right? I'm coarse-graining a lot of dynamics from many neurons, right? So I'm not taking dynamics at the neuron level at all. Even at microstructures like the microcolumns, I'm taking information from very coarse-grained way. But I can think that these are areas, right? And actually, I can take these nodes here, the locations of where I record the encephalogram, as nodes of a graph. Meaning what? Meaning that if I take these as part of the whole set of points, okay, each point in this set is what I call a node, right? In a graph, what I do is the following. I assume that two nodes are connected if there's some relationship between them, which could be a direct, for example, anatomical connection, right? Or, in a way or another, a causal link. There's a causality because they are maybe indirectly connected functionally. For example, if I look at this electrode here and this electrode here, right? I perceive that these and this, right? The fact that they are both together at high activity and both together at low activity suggests that there's a connectivity there, right? There's a number of criteria that I can do to do that. One could be anatomy, right? Let's not concentrate on that here, but let's imagine that I can do that I can consider that my electrodes define, because of the correlations of activity, some kind of a network, what's called a graph in mathematics, right? This network, let's call it gamma, is made of two things. On the one hand, I have the nodes, right? In this case, the location, node I, node G, the location of the locations where I put the electrodes, right? So let's make it like this, my collection of nodes, and a collection of edges, right? My nodes are just this set, right? And what the edges? The edges are just links, okay? Which I can define, for example, as pairs in I and J. Sometimes the pairs are directed, right? One after the other are ordered, and that's an edge, right? That's a graph. That's a graph, but that's just nothing else but that I have a set of objects that are connected under a matrix of connections, right? This is purely topological, right? I'm not worried much about anything else. Okay, so I start from here. That's the structure, but I need to put the dynamics, right? And as usual, we need to simplify the picture. We need to simplify saying the following. I'm going to replace these activity levels that are on a continuum, right, by a binary choice, right? The binary choice means that my graph here is going to be made of a set of nodes, right? I just plot a part of the whole graph, and that the nodes will be either active or inactive, right? You see that this will be inactive, right? This will be active. It's an oversimplification, that's right. But it's used often in some data gathering in neuroscience, right? You decide this is active because it goes beyond a threshold, right? Or is inactive because it's below that threshold. All right, so let's take that, call it this IA. First approximation. I will consider areas active or inactive. We know from neuroscience and we know from biology that areas that are excited, right, can send signals. Remember the idea of the neuron and neuronal transfer of information. Areas that are excited can excite areas that are in the neighborhood that are inactive, right? So the idea is that I can excite my neighbors, right? So if I'm inactive, but someone close to me is active, right? This can induce to me an activation, okay? And that's the basis actually of neural stimulation and neural excitation, all right? What else I'm going to consider as approximations? Well, in a graph like this, right, some nodes will have more connections than others, right? Maybe you have 4 connections, you might have 5, someone might have maybe just 3 of them, right? So there's a different connectivity. I'm usually labeling this in the following way. If this is the node, a given node, right? The node, let's say the node I, this is the node J, right? This node will have a connectivity. It's usually called the degree, right? The number of neighbors that I have. The number of neighbors, topologically, I don't care if they are active or inactive, just how many connections do I have with my neighbors, right? And these will have different connectivity, Kj, right? All right, connectivity is heterogeneous. So actually, when we explore this in detail, the idea is that I have a distribution of connections. All right, my second approximation. I'm going to say that essentially everyone has more or less the same number of neighbors, right? This might sound a bit arbitrary, but actually in this kind of maps, this kind of graphs that I just been drawing, this is not an unreasonable approximation many times. In any case, for us, it's a necessary condition. I'm going to assume, as a hypothesis, this will be approximately a number, a fixed number, the average connectivity, right, for all the nodes in my system. Okay? In other words, you can think in my model that I'm going to discuss as a kind of a lattice. A lattice could be, for example, if k is 4, we just have 4 neighbors. You could think in a square lattice, right? Something that can actually be kind of mimicked in the lab using neuron cultures. All right. So this actually I wanted to mention that the idea that I can think in brains as networks has been a really important revolution because it has transformed to a large extent our way of approaching brain function and brain disease, right? The main player in this picture has been Olaf Sporns, right? Who almost 20 years ago presented the idea of the brain connectome, right? The large-scale connectivity of the brain as some crucial part of our understanding of brains as systems. All right, I'm considering this. Now, I need dynamics. I need to put some rules in place, all right? So how can I put a simple number of rules? And we'll find out something really interesting. The model I'm going to describe is something that we have already seen previously, right? Imagine I consider the following. Assume that, for example, if I have an active node in my system, and the neighbor is an inactive node, okay, with a probability p, right, my inactive node will become activated, all right? This kind of the one-to-one, the pairwise interaction that I'm considering here, okay? Active, inactive, active, inactive. You want this I and J, right? I'm going to assume that this is homogeneous. In reality, of course, it will depend on A and J and the position of the two nodes, whether or not they are distant, we are not, larger or smaller, etc. This will be completely homogeneous. All right? Now the thing is, I'm not connected with one, I'm connected with some of them, and I'm going to assume that with an average number, right? How can I calculate the likelihood that I become active if I have a given number of active neighbors, right? It's easy to do, and it's the essential part that we have to solve, right? For example, imagine, for simplicity, okay, that here is an active node, here is me, an inactive, and inactive. That would be k average equals 3, right? Smallest number that is relevant here. So what is the probability that from here I'm going to here? All right? Just keep it like this. So what's the probability that this node will activate me? That's very easy in this case, right? Because it's just one, so this will be p. Right? Okay, but what if I have two neighbors that are active, both of them, right? Then I want to know, because the idea in the end is to find out what's the general form of this, right? What is this probability? Okay? Well, on a first approximation, and I will go to that in a moment, this clearly should scale with the number of elements that are sending excitation. Of course, it should be higher, for sure, right? That would be, let's say, the probability, let's say P2, right? Could it be 2 times P? Maybe, we'll see, etc. And for this case, we are limited to 3, so I only have to consider these 3 cases, right? Now I have a P3 probability. Okay? That should determine. Is this 3 times P? We'll see also. All right, that's the rules related to excitation, whether or not I'm going to go up and be active myself if my neighbors are sending a signal. And you see this is actually at the source of forming waves, right? If this, you think in the brain as a pool of water, you drop a water somewhere, you generate a ripple. So here, if you have a brain that is not active, and I excite one particular place, this will ripple into this system, right? That would be the idea. Now, I need another rule. Actually, need 2 rules, but one clearly is that things in the brain are not excited forever, right? If I get an excitation, I have excitability for a while, and then that decays, right? Otherwise, we'll end into something that's fully excited all the time. Right? That's a natural process that doesn't depend on my neighbors. Who are my neighbors? What are they doing? No, I can get unexcited, right? With some decay probability alpha. All right? That's a rule that doesn't depend on who is there around me. Okay? So what is the value of these probabilities, right? On a first approximation, if p is very small, what I was saying that this is 2p or 3p is indeed a good approximation, right? Let's show how it works in general, right? And it will be an exercise for you to show that this is the case. Before doing that, I'm going to use this following notation. I'm going to say that the fraction of excited elements plus the fraction of inactive elements, is plus 1, is normalized to 1. Okay? That's a simple way of saying what's the fraction of everything in the system. Consider that I have this, that I have a given node, inactive, and I have a neighborhood of elements, some active, some inactive. Okay? This is my element I in my graph, right? I have a total number of neighbors, average k, right? Am I asking myself, if I have a fraction a of excited elements in the system, right? How likely is that this node, right, becomes active, right, with all the neighbors that they have, right? Assumptions that I'm going to make from now on. I'm taking A as an average in the system, right? In a real brain, okay, you see all the simplifications we need to make. In a real brain, what you will have is waves of activity propagating, right? So I cannot say that I can take the average of activity representing everything, right? But in my model, in a what's called a mean field model, I'm going to assume that this is a reasonable assumption. The excitability of the system is something that, if I take any node in the system, it represents well what's around it, okay? Now, what's the probability of activation of this node, given the amount of neighbors that are active, and knowing that one by one, it can activate the node with a probability p, right? It's easy to calculate, but to do it, let's do the following thing. What is the probability of not being activated? Okay? The probability of not being activated by someone who is active, right? It will be the opposite event here, is what? It's this number. What is the probability that none of my neighbors will activate me? Okay? Well, how many neighbors I have? This, all right? But only those that are active are actually contributing to that. I have to count them, right? Since this is the fraction of nodes total that are active, right? This is the number of active nodes. All right? So I have this, and automatically I have the probability of activation, let's say P of activation for this particular node will be 1 minus this number. All right? So that's the precise way of putting, under all these assumptions, that you have a mean field theory, that the node is going to get into the active state, right? This might be a bit clumsy, but we have already worked on that, right? In reliability theory, in other approximations we have made. You can do the Taylor expansion of that easily and show that if P is very small, right? Remember that this is a number between 0 and 1, this k, a reasonable value. If P is very small, this actually is P, K, A. All right? Now, from this expression, we now need to go into the overall dynamics. So we need to somehow put this as the part of the dynamics that pushes the system into get more excited, and counterbalance that with this term here, right? Let's see how is this done. Now we follow our approximation. Remember, we have replaced the graph, which is a spatial object, by a system that is essentially the topology that can be translated into averages, average activity, and average connectivity, and a number, probability of excitation, right? And now we want to complete the picture, right? Use the fact that you have also decay, etc., right? Well, we have seen that actually, if I want to say something about this is the rule that we'll need to add. I want to say something about excitation. I just need to use this quantity. If I have my set of connected parts, this gets into the excited state, right? With a probability that is just, on a first approximation, this number, right? And if you think in the diagrams we made with only 3 neighbors, this is essentially P, 2P, 3P, right? Because the 1, 2, 3 counts what fraction of the system is actually contributing to the excitation. That's going to be my factor that says how easy it is to propagate activity. Okay? So, since I'm assuming that my model brain is essentially an average between the activity of different neurons, and I consider this normalization, what is it that I'm saying? I'm saying the following. If activity is my number, and I want to find out an equation for how activity propagates, okay, I know 2 things. One is that the more activity I have in the system, the more easy actually to get it propagating. I also know that the system is finite. So I actually activate the part of the system that is inactive, okay? And on the other hand, I have a rule that says that those active parts can spontaneously decay into inactivity. But doesn't it sound familiar? Think about it. What I'm saying is, I have a pool of elements that are the part of the brain that is excited. I have the rest, which is inactive, right? How are they related to each other? Well, you see, this rule here says that I can go from inactive to active, right? Provided that the active elements excite the inactive ones. At what rate? Well, at this rate. P, K, A. And it's interesting because here you have a factor that involves how excitable is the system, something that it's actually connected to the excitability, the physiology of the problem, right? A number that has to do with connectivity, right? How many connections is relevant, it's important. And it's deeply connected with problems in disease. What happens with the connectivity is reduced. We'll go to that in a moment, right? And this dynamical part, okay? And now I have another rule that says that spontaneously I can decay into the inactive state, all right? With some fixed number A, okay? Very good. Doesn't sound like something we know already? If you remember, we found exactly the same formal diagram when we analyzed epidemic spreading in this model, this SIS model, susceptible, infectious, infected, because it's the same thing. Here, infection means I can propagate my state into your state, which is, in this case, the inactive, right, instead of infected, and I spontaneously can decay into the inactive state. So, what is the differential equation for that? Well, remember also that what we said again, that when you have mathematical equivalences between 2 completely different systems, you are blessed by the fact that everything you have learned from one case can be translated into the other, right? Even if the meanings of the variables are different. I will grow with this factor. I am limited by this, right? Because it's a maximum amount of activity I can reach, or if you want, I grow in activity every time that an active area interacts with an inactive area, right? That's exactly the same picture. And independently of anything else, I have this decay, right? So in my diagrammatic representation, this has to do with these transitions from inactive to active, right? Because somewhere in my neighborhood of connections, right, I have the jump. Oops, sorry. The jump from the inactive to the active state. And here, in my diagrammatic representation, I have the spontaneous decay from active to inactive. That's my model. That's essentially what defines, under all the assumptions I've made, how you can describe, in this approximation, large-scale brain dynamics. And we know what's the diagram here. The bifurcation diagram for this model and for this model, right? Now my parameter is this here, right? No, let's make it right. Again, as with the SIS model, I have two fixed points. 0, right? When there's no activity. Remember that in the diagram of minimum activity, maximum activity, I have something there, which is the coma state or death, right? And another alternative state, this is a trivial fixed point. My alternative state will be alpha over pk, right? So this contains, again, a number of important parameters, all of them relevant in terms of the physiology, the clinics, the disease state, right? This would be the equivalent of my infected state in the SIS model. So activity in brain, in the bifurcation diagram, where I have this parameter here that I just made up, that takes into account everything, will have a transition point, right, somewhere. See if I define this, that's mu c just equal 1, right? Between two phases. In one phase, right, I have 0 as my fixed point, right? That would be the case when the real brain, so to speak, will have a very low or 0 dynamics. We'll go for that in a moment. Why not strictly 0? Okay? And for this state here, the 0 state is not anymore stable, right? My fixed point here. I'm just using what I know from the epidemic spreading model. Brain will be active, right? But you can see the amplitude of the oscillations that we'll have, the underlying overall activity, could be very large. So actually, this here, in the real brain, you see that in our model, we don't have oscillations. We just have overall activity. That will have these not desirable states, right? It will be the local field, right? It will be epileptic. Epileptic disease, again, is highly synchronized, but order here is not good at all, right? As disorder here is not good at all. That's the big question now, and that's the beautiful thing of this model. As simple as it is, points into something really interesting. It has to be a point in my system where order and disorder probably coexist, right? This is the critical point. Criticality, a term that has already emerged in other lectures, the quasi-species model, is something that says that is a sharp transition between two different regimes. Where is the human brain actually lives? Interestingly, the human brain lives here, at the critical point, at the compromise between order and disorder. That's an idea that was actually suggested years ago by an Argentinian physicist, Dante Chialvo, who suggested, inspired on a theory that's called self-organized criticality, the idea that brains might live what's called the edge of chaos, right? What's the meaning of the edge of chaos? Chaos is a term that we haven't explored, but it has a mathematical meaning. It means that we live right in a domain where we can take advantage of the thing that having order is important to make, for example, computations. We need order to store memory, right? To actually, in a regular way, manipulate information. We need some disorder, because disorder means that you can actually move spontaneously into other kind of states, right? Both are necessary. And this is also a conjecture that was formulated by Christopher Langton. We'll go to that into a different lecture, right? The idea that maybe life lives at the edge of chaos, because there's a place where computation, adaptability can be more easily achieved, right? Of course, the model has some simplifications, okay? One of them is that we ignore an important part of the story that is easy to introduce, and that's going to be an exercise for you. What happens if the brain goes into the non-active state, as defined in this model, right? Here, this is it's called an absorbing state. You go there, and you will never escape from that, right? That's, of course, not the case in the real world. You can be brain dead and go back into life, right? And it happens to occur, actually, that there's a rule we haven't considered, but you can consider and go into the model and introduce it, of a spontaneous activation in the system. So I'm inactive, there's some potential excitability that actives me, and then I can start propagating activity, right? If you introduce this, right, you have to do it as an exercise, what you will show up is that the model slightly changes, but it changes in some sense, right? In such a way that for small, this is a small number, of course, for small values of this, you almost are there, right? But your bifurcation diagram now looks like this, right? So there's a slight change here, which has some relevance, right? And what is more interesting, if you actually make a model of that, imagine you make a model on a lattice, and you put these as rules, right? I get excited with some probability if my neighbors are excited, etc., etc. What you will observe, right, is a reminder that we are in the good track, is that in a model like that, you will always have slight fluctuations, right? In this domain here, when you cannot propagate activity, you will observe in a lattice model, right, something like this. You're more or less brain dead, right? Except that you have small fluctuations. If you are here, right, what you will see essentially is this. You are in a high level of activity, more or less an average, right? And if you're here, right, the interesting place, you will see that you have, as it happens with the epidemic spreading models, right? Most of the time you will be low level, but sometimes you'll see waves, kind of waves, right, that propagate through the system, all right? Right on the edge of chaos, you have this possibility of having small amounts of activity. It's good, because with small amounts of activity, it means you also keep a small energy budget in place. But from time to time, you have large excursions, right? There's a lot of structure here. We are not going to go into that here, but you have fractal behavior in time and space. And amazingly, when you use models not very different from that to actually model the real human brain dynamics, what you actually observe is that many of the statistical patterns that you can actually see emerging from the human brain are captured by a critical state, right? Something that is extremely important, and is something that still we have to unravel exactly what are the consequences, okay? But we can say, again, that also in this case, complexity lives on the edge between order and disorder.